So I do, though, want to say that taking action like this can be very challenging, right? And that people who would take action like this aren't usually soldiers. They aren't usually aggressive people. They're regular people. And when they take action, that's what actually inspires us. Am I right, Josie? Am I right? It's regular people who inspire us, right? And I got to tell you, I'm going to bring on someone right now who I think is a regular guy who is making some impact too. I think that's true. In fact, I asked them an important question one day. I was talking to him. I said, hey, Clint, do you know the difference between wallpaper and toilet paper? And he said no. And I said, that's nasty. Yes, Clint is. He is a child of the Ron. It took you some time to get these. See, these are slow burning ones. They're slow burning jokes. They are. Yes, he is the child of the Ron Paul Revolution. He's an entrepreneur, former real estate investor that retired and dedicated his career to speaking against the lockdowns and increasing the increasing loss of liberty in America. He is host of the Liberty Lockdown podcast. The man himself, Clint Russell.
I absolutely know the difference between wallpaper and toilet paper. The fuck is this? We stand on the precipice of empire collapse. More accurately, we meet here tonight mid-collapse. More importantly, we stand on the precipice of the greatest opportunity in human history. Most of us in this room have wanted to see the empire end for at least 2 decades, since the start of the global war on terror and the full rollout of the surveillance state. But the grim reality of its inevitable end now approaches, and the moral imperative that it does not diminish the domestic consequences which are sure to come with it. The federal government, despite functioning in peacetime, has been running deficits that surpass those last seen in World War II or Vietnam. Sure, we are occupying many nations and have been fighting Russia via the proxy of Ukraine, but still, without a major troop deployment, we are already spending as if we're in an all-out world war. Really let that sink in. Think about what it means to you and your kids. Perhaps we have already entered World War III. Let's hope not. Many people believe this to be the case, with the creation and release of COVID-19 being the shot heard around the world in more ways than one. Corny vaccine joke for you guys there. It's impossible to know for sure in real time. Most global wars reach a tipping point that is only identifiable in hindsight, like the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Seeing as Anthony Fauci funded the research via the CIA cutout of EcoHealth Alliance and Peter Daszak, it is very hard to say whether it was the U.S. or the CCP which fired the first shot, or even if they are truly adversaries. Nonetheless, the financial consequences are upon us. 70 years of playing global police force at the behest and benefit of the bankers and corporate overlords has left an indelible mark, an unpayable one, and the bill has come due. Flashback to March of this year. Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and Silvergate all went under in a matter of days. The banking contagion had begun. Swiftly, the Treasury and Fed rolled out the Bank Term Funding Program, the BTFP. $150 billion was borrowed from this program within days. The crisis was, seemingly, averted. Months later, First Regional Bank was allowed to implode, as opposed to their other counterparts which had been bailed out. They had not met the arbitrary limit of $200 billion of deposits and were deemed not to be systemically important. Cronyism 101. Or, too big to fail. This is where an understanding of Austrian economics comes in very handy. Let me explain what transpired. The Federal Reserve had held interest rates at or near the zero bound for 15 years straight. Suicidal. Insane. Ever since the Great Recession of 2008, which is when I came out of college, another almost entirely government-created fiasco, but that's for another day. The malinvestment created by artificially decreasing the cost of capital for 15 years straight has been devastating. When your children look at the cost of rent or you look at the price of housing, make no mistake, this is an entirely government-created crisis. Housing values have doubled in many markets just over the past 3 years alone. In the teeth of an alleged global pandemic, no less. We can thank Trump, Fauci, and the economically illiterate scumbags known as Congress for inflating this bubble to devastating heights. But I digress. Back to the BTFP. So, what happened? In 2020, the trillions in fiat and debt that the Treasury and Congress created went flooding into the banking sector. The regulatory bodies simultaneously changed the liquidity guidelines for the banks so as to make cash on hand comparable to the bank holdings of long-term debt instruments, including T-bills, bonds, and mortgage-backed securities. Now, you don't need to be an economic savant to understand that a debt instrument is not the same as cash. In a liquidity crunch, cash is king. All other assets will almost always come crashing down as financial players need cash to service their own debt. So here's what happened. After the explosive spending of 2020 through 2021 and the coinciding decrease in supply thanks to the lockdowns, we began to experience double-digit inflation. In response, Jay Powell and the Fed board began rapidly increasing the Fed funds rate. This is the underlying rate by which nearly all debt markets globally set their baseline. This hiking cycle was so rapid and vicious that it now is in competition to surpass the 1980s. Which was the prior record set by Paul Volcker. Yes, the ceiling ended up being much higher, but it depends on where you start. We are truly living through yet another historical financial manipulation. Here's how this broke the banks. Since the banks were sitting on record cash deposits in 2020, and since the regulators changed their guidelines for liquidity, the bank CFOs dutifully plunged their reserves into long-term debt. So why sit in cash when you can make an extra couple points on your reserves risk-free? Or so they thought. When Powell and Company started hiking rates, it immediately created paper losses on these holdings. With rates around 5% today, the paper losses are now in the hundreds of billions, and the BTFP sunsets 12 months after its inception, in other words, March of 2024, which is less than 100 days from now. The banks which have accessed the BTFP are not required to publicly report the amount utilized, so we are basically flying blind in evaluating how dangerous all this is. The true reach of this contagion will not be known until March of next year, and even then, I assume they will attempt to paper it over and kick the can once more. What makes this something of a dance on the edge of a razor blade is that inflation has not been defeated. We have seen disinflation, which is good, but prices have still been rising just at a slower pace, contrary to Joe Biden, who tweets out economically illiterate nonsense. All this despite the harshest interest rate hiking cycle in a generation. If they don't let the market self-correct, then we may be en route to Weimar, and that is not an overstatement. Okay, enough with the scary shit. Here's the opportunity part. Whether you believe Javier Milei is true to his words is not relevant. In the wake of many decades of socialism-derived hyperinflation, the Argentinian people were finally willing to throw caution to the wind and cast their votes for a chainsaw-wielding, tantric sex coach economics professor who is a self-described anarcho-motherfucking capitalist. If that doesn't get you fired up, you need to check your pulse. A tantric sex coach? Are you kidding me? It's ridiculous. On top of that, despite all the censorship we discovered thanks to the Twitter leaks, we still have the capacity for viral messaging that has never been seen in human history. Dave Smith just had Tucker Carlson on his show, the #1 nightly newsman in America. My show with Luke Rutkowski reaches 100,000 people per night. My own show, Liberty Lockdown, reaches millions per year. A 37-year-old mortgage broker turned YouTuber. Who says this isn't still the land of opportunity? Josie here's got 550,000 followers, for God's sakes. It's insane. The leading presidential candidate for 2024 is facing 700 years in prison. His supporters don't care. They are wrong to believe he is their savior, but they are absolutely right when they chant "fuck CNN" and scream fake news. Tens of millions of Americans know viscerally that they are being fucked over. Many don't know how, they don't understand the who, the what, or even sometimes the why. They only know that it's happening. It is our job to lend them a hand in completing the portrait of their enslavement and ultimately a pathway to liberation. On the left, millions have flooded the streets in the defense of Palestine over the past month. They may view the conflict through a critical theory lens. They may unwittingly do the bidding of George Soros. It's irrelevant. They are calling for peace and non-intervention. The right has been exhausted by 20 years of war. They seek peace in Ukraine. Our job is to use that momentum for a more non-interventionist foreign policy. Given the potential for all-out world war between the Arab world versus Israel, NATO and the U.S. versus Russia, China, and Iran, the stakes have never been higher. We can and must set our differences aside and work together to avoid this existential calamity. Despite the efforts of the largest government in human history, which is working in tandem with the largest corporations in human history, despite a man-made pandemic, despite lockdowns, despite an attempted coup against a sitting president, despite a weaponized domestic police force known as the FBI, despite the most powerful military in world history, despite alien psyops, despite the $34 trillion in debt, despite the parabolic rate curve, despite the mental health crisis, despite the infringements on all our rights, we are still standing. In fact, we've only just learned how to walk, and it is quickly becoming a sprint, as best I can tell. The world may only listen to us when the crisis has arrived. Well, guess what? It's here. Do not shrink from this moment. Embrace the opportunity and let them hear us collectively. My ragtag individualist nutcases you. It is our world now. It is our turn to carry forth the torch lit by our founders. It is our turn to create the financial rails of the future via Bitcoin and sound money. It is our turn to create the media titans of the next century. The old world is dying. It was a world propelled by the destruction of innocence. Let us not mourn its passing, but instead usher in an era that is built on the foundational principles of libertarianism: peace, prosperity, property rights, voluntary exchange. Do not let the daunting nature of this task discourage you. We have but one life to lead. There is no way out but through. Let's get after it as if there is no tomorrow. I have full faith, despite all of the odds stacked against us, that we can and will prevail. This is our time. Let's not squander it. Let's make Dr. Paul proud, huh? Questions, if you like.
Oh, do you need some questions?
I was told to ask.
I'm gonna say, yeah. I'm happy to do that if you want. Does anybody
If anybody's got any
question? Can I say something quick? Of course, please.
That was the Thomas Paine shit that I was talking about earlier. Right there. These are people who inspire somebody.
Absolutely. Any questions for Clint? Thank you, Clint.
No questions. Come on.
Thank you.
I flew from Miami. You asked me a question.
So I'm so happy to hear that. And yes, I was teasing about the paper thing. Yes, I was just teasing. Yes, absolutely. I'm the one who didn't know difference, and so I wanted to embarrass someone else. That's all. Yes. So no.